Sibiu. Is one of the biggest cities of Romania, but our hotel is not so far.
Arriving late afternoon at Sibiu Airport, we were met by Natalia, who was to be our guide for the next 5 days in Romania, along with George, the driver. We checked in at the Hotel Silva, had dinner, and began to get to know our fellow travellers, and the next morning were ready to set off on our first excursion. A short drive took us to the old city of Sibiu with our motley group of 17 altogether, including Natalia and Roger Lord from Noble Caledonia. That's him at the back there in the blue shirt, leaning against the wall. We had a rough idea what to expect behind the walls of a medieval city in Transylvania, but were surprised to find that a lot of it was relatively modern, with small supermarkets and shop chains. The woman in the white blouse and the maroon skirt, Pam, was to cause us more problems on this holiday than anything else. She had the most horrendous cough and cold and passed it on to everybody. The first records of Sibiu go back to 1191. By the 14th century, it was an important trade centre, but more recently, in 2007, it was designated the European Capital of Culture, along with Luxembourg. This ancient post, we were told, was for craftsmen to nail in symbols representing their trade in order to bring them good luck. But it was only when I looked at this piece of film later that I noticed that the date on the post was 2004. We walked around the Catholic cathedral, but only on our way to the Orthodox Cathedral of St. Nicholas, where we went inside to see the murals and frescoes. Although it was very quiet and peaceful inside as we wandered around, somewhere nearby a large gathering was going on as students from the seminary were holding a reunion, and we bumped into some of them outside. Lunch at a local restaurant provided us with some very fatty lamb, after which we went back to the hotel for a while. Set in the woods, the hotel had some pretty noisy neighbours. But these birds were much quieter. We saw plenty of them in Transylvania, and here we are in Sibiel, where we visited a bacon tower, where all the meats and cheeses were hung up to mature. And they made some pretty good plum brandy as well. Not far away we were taken to an old church and its cemetery. We found the packed cemetery quite interesting and picturesque. In fact, more so than what we'd been brought here to see. And there are actually two buildings here. The first one still operates as a church, and like many others has incredible wall paintings inside. The second has been converted into a museum with a huge collection of rare icons painted on glass and going back centuries. And finally, traditional music, which was dreadful, on our way for a traditional meal. We didn't like that either. But the next morning, we made a short stop at Beertan and its 15th century fortified church. It seems that everything is fortified in Transylvania, like the medieval walled city of Sighisoara, where we walked uphill and through the arched entrance onto the cobbled streets. This old town was very atmospheric, with the centrepiece being a magnificent 14th century tower. We sat on a bench in the shade while others went to the top. Back in the square, we waited for the rest of the group to assemble. We'd been told that we were to have lunch at the Dracula House restaurant. We saw it, and it looked awful. So we were very pleased when instead we were taken to a much nicer place for a decent meal down in the main town. A 2-hour drive then took us to Brasov, where we checked in to the Arrow Palace Hotel. The next morning, we were at the very first Romanian school, believed to have started in the 15th century, and learned a little about what life would have been like then. And in the same building, the first Romanian printing press, which produced their first school books and their first Bible. And upstairs, an extraordinary collection of books, some of them nearly 700 years old. This lovely old building with the school and the press was in the same grounds as the Church of St. Nicholas. where the only thing of note to say about it is that the ladies on duty there were very fierce about stopping people filming and taking photos inside. Next stop was at a champagne cellar, where we were able to taste some of the vintages. We were shown around the process of bottling and corking, and then we toasted the health of Anne and Matt, who were celebrating their 55th wedding anniversary today.
Cheers! No.
After lunch there of barbecued chicken and a great tiramisu, we moved on to Pelesh Castle. This gorgeous castle in a beautiful setting was built by King Carol I in 1875 and heavily influenced by his wife, Queen Maria. And there's a lovely statue of her in the garden depicting her sewing. The castle was opened to the public as a museum in 1993. Again, no photos and no filming allowed inside. It wasn't long before the weather changed, and we had to take a small land train pulled by a tractor to visit the Raznov citadel high on a hill. Started in 1211, this fortress was built as part of a defence system for the nearby villages that could have been liable to outside invasion. And now that it's raining a little, the cobbles and gravel on the paths have become quite slippery. Today, Natalia led us on a walk into the old town of Brasov. We saw roofers working in a way they'd never be allowed to at home. And the main street here led us to a huge square, one of the finest, it said, in the country, and said to be the spot to which the legendary Pied Piper led the children of Hamelin. What is true is that on top of the old town hall in the centre is the Trumpeter's Tower, used for warning citizens of approaching danger in the Middle Ages. But we were heading to the Black Church, called this because it was set on fire by invading Habsburg forces in 1689. Again, no photos allowed inside, but I did sneak this one. We decided to leave the group tour and do our own thing by going up the cable car in the hills behind Brasov. It was not a good decision. The way to the lower cable car station involved a long uphill walk in a cobbled lane, followed by loads of steps. At the top station, everything was fairly enclosed and there was nowhere from which to look down on the city. The walk to the viewpoint was a bit treacherous, with a 45-degree slope on a very stony, gravelly path, which was slippery. We decided not to risk it and just got in the cable car to come back down again. but at least we had a decent view of the Black Church. At the bottom, the steps and the descending slope seemed even worse, and I was very glad to get back to the hotel. David had a little walk to film some traffic while I had a lie down, and then we went out to dinner. The restaurant seemed very touristy, but the atmosphere was good, the food was very good, and so was the entertainment.
Let's hear the birds from Transylvania. The birds. La cioara in Romania.
An early start the next morning took us to Bran and the castle of Vlad the Impaler, also known as Dracula's castle. Although Vlad was not a vampire, he was definitely a nasty piece of work. He wasn't called the Impaler for nothing, and inflicted brutal punishments on his enemies. The name Dracula has its origins in the Order of the Dragon, through which Vlad's father was called Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon, and the diminutive form, meaning son of Dracul, is Dracula. Bram Stoker, the creator of the famous Dracula stories, is never thought to have been to Romania, and the whole modern myths of Transylvania and the Dracula character are something built up by Hollywood over the years. Natalia told us that most Romanians actually hate this image and feel that it spoils the concept of the beautiful region known as Transylvania. And that name simply means the land across the hills and trees. Apparently there's no proof either that Vlad the Impaler actually visited this castle, which was started in 1377. It became a customs post on the mountain pass, and it's believed that it was built almost exclusively for the protection of German colonists in Transylvania. It became the favourite home of Queen Marie of Romania and was used by her daughter as a hospital in the Second World War. In 1948, following the expulsion of the royal family, the castle was seized by the communists. In 2009, the Habsburgs opened the refurbished castle to the public as the country's first private museum. When we arrived, we saw that the army were on duty there. Some were heavily camouflaged in foliage and were setting up games and a long zip wire for children. It was a long drive next through the beautiful countryside to Fertesti, where we were to join the boat, and we stopped for lunch along the way in a lovely classical building, now the Vienna Cafe. And this is the route we took from Sibiu up to Sighișoara, down to Brasov, and eventually to the Danube and Fertesti. It was early evening when we joined the Royal Emerald. It was really quiet here, with nothing but the sounds of ducks, geese, and mosquitoes. We had a few hours to find our way around the boat and to get to know a few people before having a very early lunch, because at 12:15 we were heading on a smaller boat to go further downstream to the Danube Delta. And this is Mila 35, called that because it's 35 nautical miles from somewhere, but I'm not sure where. This used to be a luxury hotel, now just a crumbling ruin. Here's the smaller boat we've joined for our trip to the Delta. Our guide talked a lot about the flora and fauna we could expect to see. Of course, we hardly saw any of it, and failed to remember most of what he said. The trip to the Delta was not as good as we thought it would be. The boat itself was larger than we were expecting, so we didn't get into some of the smaller channels. We seemed to travel along a few of the main water highways through the Delta, along with other tourists and locals seemingly going far too fast in speedboats. We saw very little, apart from a few pelicans, locals having picnics on the banks, and a lot of plastic left by other locals before them. Why would birds stick around to be seen when people are doing this? Back at Mila 35, we took the dodgy path back along to the Royal Emerald. The Delta trip took so long there and back that it was late morning by the time we were back at Fetesti again. We were to have only half a day in Bucharest, and even that meant setting off at 12:45 with a 2-hour drive to get there. Bucharest was designated the capital of Romania in 1881. Between the world wars, the city was redesigned by French and Romanian architects trained in Paris. Streets were transformed into tree-lined boulevard, there was a triumphal arch, and the city became known as the Little Paris of the East. It was Romania's dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, who ordered that a palace of the parliament be built in the capital. It is huge. It took about 13 years to build and is now a colossal white elephant. About 70% of it remains empty, and the cost of heating and lighting alone is more than $6 million a year, as much as powering a medium-sized city. About 40,000 people lost their homes for this palace to be built. Monasteries and 37 factories and workshops were demolished to make way for the building and its grounds, and as many as 3,000 workers died in the process. In a central park in Bucharest is the National Village Museum, with authentic peasant houses, farms and churches which have been moved here, 272 of them altogether. The problem for us was that we were only able to go inside a very few of them, and having been to village museums in the UK and in Norway, we did find this one a little disappointing, and it was very hot walking around. When we left the park, we were intrigued because our itinerary showed that we were to enjoy an excellent buffet dinner at the Phoenicia Hotel. Well, it wasn't excellent. The hot food was almost cold, and even if it had been hot, it wasn't very special. The saving grace was that we had some superb live music from a local troupe. After dinner, we had a short stroll around the hotel and took a look at a small art exhibition there. By morning, we'd crossed the border into Bulgaria and headed off to the little church on the rock. And this church is quite literally carved into the rocks, high above a small monastery. It's a steep climb up to the church, and I decided to stay behind while David joined a few others and went up there. Although the monastery is in a lovely picturesque spot, it's memorable for one thing really, and that's that when you go through the entrance there's a monk waiting to dip his paintbrush in holy water and paint a cross on your forehead. We both managed to avoid this unnecessary blessing. The Royal Emerald was moored at the town of Russe, and we're driving back there now to see the Holy Trinity Church. It was built in 1632, when Bulgaria was under Ottoman rule. Churches were not allowed to be built so that they were taller than Muslim temples and mosques, so they dug down instead. And we walked down a flight of steps, not to go into a crypt, but into the main entrance. Back above ground we had a walking tour of Russe. This is the Opera House. And the town centre has wide open squares and fountains and some much welcome shade from many trees in the sweltering heat. Russe is a city popular with tourists, referred to sometimes as Little Vienna because of its architecture and also its culture. We stopped at a restaurant for a so-called wine tasting session. When we asked about the wines, the waiters just said it was red, white or rosé. They didn't have a clue. And it was at some point there that I saw Pam, Our Lady of the Phlegm, being bundled into a taxi to be taken to hospital. We ourselves had to find a pharmacy for something to ease the cough which she'd passed on to us. And later, back on the boat, we were treated to a lively exhibition of folk music and dancing. Another day, another coach drive. This time to Arbanasi to visit a merchant's house built in the 17th century. And he was obviously a wealthy merchant. The lower half of the house is mainly stone with wooden layers designed to better withstand earth tremors. One example of the owner's wealth is that he even had an indoor toilet, even if it is just a hole in the floor. No going out in the winter cold. A few minutes' walk away was the extraordinary Nativity Church, which had the most beautiful frescoes covering nearly every inch of the walls and ceilings. Lunch was at a hotel in Veliko Tarnovo. The views from the hotel, perched on steep cliffs, were stunning, and the lunch was pretty good as well. After lunch, we were in for another treat. Not far away was the church of Saints Peter and Paul. It had brightly coloured frescoes and a lovely atmosphere, but we were not expecting this. And after that very moving performance, we went back into Veliko Tarnovo, where it had started raining, to see the narrow, cobbled artisans' street. There were lovely old houses and shops here, where tradesmen and women practiced their art and sold their wares. But I have to say there was also a lot of tourist tat on display, probably made in China. The following day we were still in Bulgaria, but had moved on to the port of Vidin. From there, our excursion was to the Ottoman fort at Belogradchik. Originally started in Roman times, it's strategically placed amid natural rocks, now quite weathered. The fortress is very impressive, with a long walk up steps to a vantage point high up. Neither of us did that walk as it looked pretty hard going, and we enjoyed the view from where we were anyway. The next fortress, Baba Vida, was a different matter altogether. Begun in the 10th century, it was eventually used as an armoury and a prison. There was still a little water in the moat, which was filled with noisy, croaking frogs. And from the castle walls there were great views out over the Danube. But we were only allowed about 10 minutes there because we had a deadline to meet. We were rushed back to the boat and had only a few minutes for a loo break before setting off on foot to the Vidin Philharmonic Hall for a short early evening concert. A day on the boat today, thank goodness, and we thought it would be nice to have a lie-in. But my cough woke me up at about 5:45, and when I looked out of the window I saw that we were already in the first lock we were expecting today. So we just had to get up and see what was going on. A pair of dogs with their puppies arrived as well, no doubt looking for scraps from the crews of boats that passed through. After breakfast, we were up on deck again, relaxing and reading, until the next lock came into view in the distance. Once we started going into the loch, we were surprised because we were told that it was about 30 metres high, and it didn't appear to be anywhere near that tall. But when we were through the loch, we found that it led straight into another one immediately behind, and that was much higher. And the whole process took about 3 hours. And here we are finally entering loch number 2, and we went and had lunch while it was filling. By now we'd travelled into land that was once Yugoslavia, and on the bank there was a large monument to Tito. We were now in the area known as the Iron Gates. We'd already passed the locks, the first iron gates, and we were to go through the gorge, which forms part of the boundary between Serbia on one side and Montenegro on the other. On the Serbian side, there was a Roman plaque cut into the rock just above water level. It commemorates the Emperor Trajan, who built a bridge at this spot. It was completed in 105 AD. On the other Romanian bank, a huge likeness has been carved into the rock of Decebalus, the last king of Dacia and opponent of Trajan. This is very recent though, and wasn't begun until 1992. It's 141 feet high, the tallest rock relief in Europe, and towers over the gorge. There's also a small, picturesque, Orthodox monastery perched on the rocks right by the river. At its narrowest, the gorge here closes in to about 150 metres, just over 490 feet. But the fast-flowing water goes down to a depth of about 174 feet. Another early start, not out of choice this time, but because of music from a gay club across the river. It closed at 6 a.m. Our first excursion into Belgrade left at 8:30 to a central park and fort complex. It's now a military museum with over 3,000 ancient and modern weapons. We didn't stay there long, just enough to enjoy the view over the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, and also across the city. Next, we went to the tomb of President Tito. While he's still revered by some, we really didn't want to see the tomb and sat in the shade by a nearby fountain opposite the Museum of Yugoslav History. Saint Sava was the founder of the Serbian Orthodox Church. This temple, dedicated to him, had some restoration work going on, so we were only allowed down into the crypt. The ceilings and walls are stunning, and the only thing spoiling it all was the large group of noisy schoolchildren who arrived just as we did. Building started on this church in 1935 and was stopped during the Second World War and continued only recently in 1985. There was a much older and smaller church next door. Again, many more wall paintings and icons. There's another musical treat coming up as we're taken to a theatre for a wonderful performance of local folk dancing and music. It's important to remember that these people are not professionals. They're very enthusiastic amateurs who give up their free time to keep these traditional dances going. After lunch, we had the afternoon to sit on deck and enjoy the views. And the first thing we noticed was how high the river was at the moment. Many houses were standing in water, and in one or two cases, they were completely surrounded by it. At one point, we saw hundreds of horses, foraging in very shallow water in some cases, or in the tiny patches of what was left of their normal feeding ground. The village of Sremski Karlovci was our first stop today. On the banks of the Danube, it claims to be the prettiest village in Serbia. It was early on Sunday morning when we arrived and very quiet there. Refreshments were provided at the Hotel Duvar on our way back to Novi Sad. We were moored close to a simple but moving monument on the riverbank to the thousands of Jews and Serbs murdered here and thrown into the river in just a few days in January 1942. Novi Sad was devastated by NATO bombing in 1999 during the Kosovo War. All 3 bridges across the Danube were destroyed and residential areas were cluster bombed. But now the city has more or less returned to normal and a great deal of rebuilding and redevelopment has taken place. Novi Sad is the second largest city in Serbia. It looks idyllic now, especially in the warm summer sun, but in the winter of 1942, thousands of Jews, Serbs and Roma were killed by the Nazis in just a few days. Many were made to walk across the frozen ice on the Danube, which was then shelled so that they fell through and were drowned or frozen to death. Others were shot and thrown in. When a naval vessel passed us, we weren't sure why the sailors stood to attention on deck. But this was the exact spot where all those people were killed, and this, we think, was their salute. Lunch was back on board the Royal Emerald, after which we stayed up on deck for a while admiring the view. Eventually, though, it was so hot there that I couldn't stand it anymore and went down to the air conditioning in the lounge. Today we're in Hungary, and once the immigration officials had come on board to check us all out, a coach took us to the city of Pécs. There we had a walking tour and visited the Catholic cathedral. And after a talk from our guide, we sat through a very short and not very inspiring organ recital. We had a break for a cool drink at the Hotel Palatinus, where the bar seemed to have an aviation theme to it, though we don't know why. With some free time, we stopped nearby to watch something that was a cross between a Punch and Judy show and fortune-telling. Pécs is an interesting city with a lovely main square, dominated by a large mosque, which overlooks a very simple fountain of water trickling down over a series of steps. Then on to Villani to enjoy lunch at a family-run restaurant and to do some wine tasting. Well, the lunch was dreadful. My beef stew was just a great pile of fat sitting in gravy, and we also had to put up with a crazy accordionist. And here we are in one of Hungary's top wine regions, and most of the wine brought to the table for us to try tasted as bad as the food did. All in all, it was not a good lunch. It's 8:30 in the morning, for goodness sake, at Caledonia, not the sort of time of day when you expect folk dancing. This is what's known as an ethnographic museum. It's all about people's cultures, customs and habits. So that's why we had the folk dancing, followed by a look inside a traditional Hungarian house and its traditional Hungarian contents, which involved a lot of patterned aprons, tablecloths and clothes. We couldn't get too excited by it. But Carloccia's main claim to fame is paprika. It grows many acres of paprika peppers, said to be among the best in the world, and this is the lady who told us all about it. Before we went on to Carloccia's cathedral. It's quite impressive inside, being nearly all white and gold. We sat through a 20-minute organ recital, but the acoustics here were such that when the organist pulled out all the stops, which he did regularly, there were so many echoes and reverberations that it all meshed together rather uncomfortably. Although it was cool in the cathedral, we were glad to get outside again, as we were about to head for the most interesting part of the day at the Puszta horse farm and an equestrian show, which began not with horses, but with two magnificent oxen, Hungarian greys, on display. There were various displays of horsemanship and whip-cracking by the Magyar cowboys. To begin with, there were 4 of them on horseback showing off their skills, along with the comedy act, which was one guy on a donkey.
Once again, the name of the riders is Chikós in Hungarian donkey. And the donkey, these are creamy riders.
The horses were trained to sit or to lie down, techniques they may have had to use in battle long ago to make themselves smaller targets, but now done just for our entertainment.
Now you can see the Puszta siesta. That is the way how the riders were resting after a few shots of brandy. These beautiful identical ones. About the construction itself, as you can see, it's quite light and
After the show, we took a walk around the stables and saw not just horses, but the birds that had taken up residence there in the rafters. Also on offer was the chance to take a short ride in a traditional gypsy caravan trailer. Back on board, it was sweltering, both on deck and inside, because the boat's air conditioning had packed up completely. While I went to bed as we approached Budapest, David went upstairs and tried to film a little of our arrival into the Hungarian capital. In the morning, when I went up on deck at about 5:30, I was amazed to see that we were moored in what seemed to be pole position. The prow of the boat was about as close as it could be to the chain bridge. Directly across the river from us on the Buda side, we had a great view of the castle area, the Fisherman's Bastion, and Matthias Church. After breakfast, we went on a tour of the city. The coach took us around various sites on the lower Pest side, including Hero Square. The last time we saw it, in 2003, it looked like this. This visit couldn't have been more different. The temperature was about 36 degrees centigrade, and we were certainly hoping that the aircon on the boat would be fixed by the time we got back. This very ornate part of the castle wall of Buda was built between 1895 and 1902. In the Middle Ages, the old wall is said to have been protected by the Guild of Fishermen, who lived under the walls in a place called Fishtown. What else? Consequently, the ramparts now are known as the Fisherman's Bastion. Apart from being very picturesque, there are terrific views here over the Danube and also behind to Matthias Church. And the one thing you can't miss across the river is the Hungarian Parliament building. As we continued our tour, we passed some of the tributes placed at the spot where a tourist boat was hit and capsized only a few weeks before. 28 South Koreans were killed in that accident. And further along we saw the Metal Shoes, a memorial to the 3,500 people who were ordered to take off their shoes here and were then shot and thrown into the river in December 1944 and January 45. We had the afternoon to ourselves, so with Val, a fellow passenger, we caught a tram just a few stops along to visit Budapest's huge indoor market hall. In spite of the heat, we walked back along the main pedestrian area. At least it was in the shade. The air conditioning had been repaired by the time we returned to the boat. And after dinner, we were due to leave Budapest at about 9 p.m. We were not expecting the floodlit city to look quite so spectacular. We're on our way now to Bratislava in Slovakia. The usual fits of coughing woke us up early, and after breakfast we went up and watched our approach into another lock. We waited there for a commercial boat to come alongside, and the whole process took a couple of hours. By the time we'd reached Bratislava, the temperature had crept up again to about 35 or 36 centigrade. I decided to stay in the cool of our cabin to read, and fell asleep, while David joined others and went on a walking tour of the city. The old medieval city has plenty of narrow, winding streets, overlooked by the hilltop castle. It's one of the smaller capitals of Europe, with a population of about 430,000. Now this is our last full day. The Hotel Astoria is where we stayed when we came here in 2001. There were two organised tours today. The first was the city tour beginning at 8 a.m. The second, to Schönbrunn Palace, was leaving at 12:30. Well, we certainly didn't want the early start and to then find ourselves marching en masse through the city in the heat. And having been to Vienna before, we didn't want to traipse around the Schönbrunn either. So we had a late breakfast, long after most people had gone, and set off on our own. We went for a round trip on a hop-on, hop-off bus, where at least we could enjoy the breeze on an open top deck. Having stopped for a drink at the Café Mozart before the bus tour, we decided to go back there for lunch. And then went to St. Stephen's Cathedral, with its wonderful mosaic roof with over 2,000 tiles. And so we reached the end of our cruise on the Danube. We had a hot walk from the metro station back to the Royal Emerald. and the evening consisted of dinner and packing, ready to leave for the airport at 10 the next morning.